So hi everyone, welcome to this Provar webinar. Thanks very much for joining. Today we're excited to be talking about how to achieve best practice ServiceMax testing and share a bit about the testing solution that Provar's developed for ServiceMax customers. So just to start off with some introductions, my name is Hetty Boardman-Weston and I'm Head of Marketing at Provar. Presenting with me today, I'm very excited to welcome Chuck Meredith from ServiceMax, as well as Geraint Waters and Bridgette Daly from Provar. And I'll be passing over to Chuck in a minute to start things off. If we carry on by taking a quick look at the agenda today, we'll see that we're going to start by talking about some of the challenges around the ServiceMax upgrade space and what solutions are available for that. And then we'll move on to talking about the testing solution that Provar's developed for ServiceMax and get into a few live product demos. And then we should have some time at the end to talk about our roadmap and answer any questions that you might have about the content that you've seen today. So on the subject of questions, if you'd like to ask one at any point, please feel free to do so. The best way to do that is by typing it out into the questions box, and we'll try and make sure that these are picked up at the end of the session. All in all, we expect the webinar to last approximately 45 minutes, and it is being recorded as well. So I will send the video recording around to all sign-ups tomorrow, and then you can watch it again, or you're welcome to share it with any team members as well. Okay, so that's it from me. At this point, I will hand over to Chuck Meredith from ServiceMax. Welcome, Chuck.
Yep, thank you. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us today. Hetty, could you actually advance it one slide, please?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So for those of you that don't know me, I've been with ServiceMax for about 8 years now. I spent the first 5 managing implementation teams and the last 3 leading the support organization. My move to the support organization coincided with ServiceMax's decision to make a big investment in the organization, and we've continued those investments every year since. The team's grown to more than 60 people worldwide, and we're continuing to grow. We specialize teams and offerings. We support custom code, consult where needed, offer hypercare for critical activities, help with upgrades, and even assist with testing. I'm very proud to say that we have a 95% overall CSAT rating. We hit 99% of our SLAs, and as a result, our NPS score is way up. So even with everything that we've done to improve our offerings, customers are not upgrading as often as they should. We do hear a lot of reasons why, some of which include things like long testing cycles, limited testing resources, or my favorite, no focus on testing because ServiceMax will fix it for us. So I'm not saying that customers don't do testing, but some customers don't. And the problem with this is, we do fix things. We fix things all the time. But what happens is we fix things sometimes in very old or really, really old versions. As a result, we find ourselves supported back when this was a bigger problem, supporting nearly 15 server-side versions and about the same or more of various mobile clients. That means we were spending a lot of time fixing things that oftentimes were already addressed in newer releases. At the same time, customers who stayed on aging versions, they don't get to take advantage of new features and performance gains that these versions have to offer. All of this in mind, in July of 2018, we introduced an active maintenance window policy. This policy requires customers to be on a current version of ServiceMax, and we define current as the current release plus the last 2 major releases. Now, knowing that this would be a big challenge and a big change, quite frankly, for our customers, we created a new global team dedicated to helping our customers with their upgrades. We also introduced a pre-check to identify potential issues before an upgrade occurred. Lastly, and most importantly, why we're on this call, we partnered with Provar to see if we could offer an automated testing solution. Yep. So we quickly saw the fit with Provar, the many benefits they had to offer. So we connected them with our product, engineering, and CCS teams. Provar has exclusive access to these teams. We're not working with any other vendor to do this. They get early releases of our products, and they've taken the time to learn a lot about what we do, our products, and field service in general. We decided not to resell their product as it added cost and complexity for our customers. We make nothing on licenses that they sell. We just want to do the right thing for all of you, including partnering with them to conduct free POCs at several of our largest customers. So hopefully I've shared enough about the journey and the reason why we've partnered. I'll now turn things over to Geraint so he can walk you through the demo.
Thank you, Chuck. So yeah, as Ashok was saying, I'm now going to just walk you through and just talk about Provar, but obviously what we'll be doing is seeing ServiceMax along the way. I guess just for people who don't know Provar, I guess I wanted to sort of paint the picture, what is happening out there at the moment. Now, what we have is obviously a lot of manual testing that goes on. Now, that's absolutely fine, and I think we should all continue manually testing in certain areas. There's a place for it, but there's not a place for it when it comes to quite laborious regression testing. So a lot of people will be on agile projects. We are wanting, sort of with that philosophy, a lot of information as quick as we can get it with regards to sort of how are the changes affecting what the system currently does. So that does push us into wanting to do some automation. There are other solutions and approaches to that automation. The first, this one, the middle point there is really talking about code-based test automation. So if anyone's familiar with Selenium, that's an example of a sort of open source project that an awful lot of people use. Provar also leverages Selenium. The difficulty there, though, is it's a lot of code. And a lot of the times we are purchasing and sort of investing in the products like ServiceMax to really reduce some of this code. And unfortunately, if you then have to add it to this sort of regression phase, the issue is it's sort of very sort of time consuming and costly to achieve that. There are also other test tools out there, but they tend to work just off the HTML of the page. So the issue there is as these sort of cloud-based solutions move on and move forward, a lot of those assumptions don't always hold true. So I guess, where does ServiceMax sit in that type of change? Well, I think actually when you have some tests against ServiceMax, if you are thinking about leveraging tools that just test the HTML, it does genuinely change quite a bit when you're going from org to org or when you're moving from SIT to UAT. So there's a reliability issue that just means you're constantly tweaking tests, and actually it could be the same code base. There's also a complexity, and that's because ServiceMax is a sort of dynamically generates HTML. It's the framework they use, which is certain very well for an application, but actually from a test automation standpoint, there are some challenges there that we do need to understand in order to get reliable tests. And I'd say the last point is really interesting because field service is something that demands testing the mobile device. Now, in many other cases where Provar tests other applications, it's really not as an important a piece, the mobile piece, because sometimes the mobile app is very locked down. But in the case of field service, it is one of the key use cases, obviously. So, we do need to test mobile, and testing mobile is very tricky traditionally. So let's just sort of spend a bit of time understand what Provar does. I mean, from our perspective, it is point and click. So you do not need to be a developer or a programmer to use Provar, which is great. Existing test teams can pick up the tool and learn it. The other thing that sort of addresses the things I mentioned in the last slide is really about metadata integration. So what's happening here is that we're saying that we don't just use the HTML on the page, we're being far more intelligent about how to locate the elements on the screen. And that's the same whether it's desktop or mobile. So I think that's a vital piece that sort of means that we really can last the test of time as things change, as releases move forward. And also, as a solution, we are able to test FSA for iOS and Android. Again, I think probably there is a number of tools that can just do generic mobile, but that's really tricky because actually the hardest thing about mobile is getting locators that are reliable. How do I locate this element? How do I click this button without it being something super fragile? So let's have a look at Provar. This is our sort of first demo we're going to look at now. And what we can see is we've got a number of screens going on my window right now. And I need to explain them before we move forward. So first and foremost, Provar is a desktop tool. At the moment, you're not actually looking at Provar Desktop, but you're looking at, on the right-hand side, is Provar Test Builder. So Provar Test Builder is telling us where we are in this particular test, and we can see there's actually some tests already been run. Now, that's a reason for that. I've done some data sync as part of ServiceMax Mobile, and it takes a few minutes. So I thought to save everyone's time, I've just done that portion of it, but we will loop back and I'll show you where all that comes from. Now, that's the right-hand side. What we're seeing in the middle is actually Provar's emulation of the application under test. So in this case, it's actually the Windows version of FSA. So it's actually the Windows 10 ServiceMax application FSA sitting on the left-hand side. Now, if we were testing on device now, we wouldn't have that. It's only because we're on Windows and I've got that. So ease of sort of authoring today, we've got all three, right? So what we're looking at though is, and it's really important, is that to see the distinction between our emulation and the actual app, we've actually got this green banner in Provar. So that's how you know. And there's also a few little buttons up here that sort of telling us something. So, and one of them in particular, you might see there's a slight lag by design because we're just emulating. So for example, if I actually move around here, you'll sort of notice the middle screen updates in its own time about when it's sort of reflecting the latest status of that screen. Now, the key thing now is that, you know, if I would imagine I don't have a test and I want to start authoring, the key thing that actually happens is I would actually choose to do right click, not in the screen under test, but in the emulation. So if you notice here, the way Provar works is in exactly the same way when we do desktop testing, which I'll show you soon, is we right click on here and we choose add to test case. And then when I choose that, what we notice in Test Builder, it switches from being something that tells us all about where we are on the test to be something about, well, how am I going to test this particular button? And in this case, what we can see is Provar's waking up and telling us all about the metadata it understands. So straight away, it's saying this is ServiceMax. It's telling us this is the ServiceMax day calendar from the perspective of understanding what it is. And then what's happening is we're basically able, if I'd wanted to, just hit the drop down and you'll notice all the other fields are actually there. Now, none of that is set up by me. It's set up because we, from metadata within Salesforce, we understand the ServiceMax pages. Now that's within ServiceMax configuration within their objects. So that's great. We understand how we can sort of start authoring. So what I'm going to do for the rest of this demo is start to sort of click around and see what's happening. So I've already clicked the today button, or I've got it mapped as such. So what I'm going to do is choose these buttons. We can go backwards, go forwards, zoom to the end. Now if I choose next, one single step, what we see is the left-hand side now click the today button. So again, from a calendar perspective, that's moved us forward. And then what we can do is we're going to start to sort of click through and do the with appointment step. And in our perspective, what's happening is it's choosing to locate our calendar that we've got. So the important part of that is the with row. This section here says with row. What that with row is telling us is I will not find any work order. I'm not going to grab one from the top of the screen because that calendar screen from our FSA client is actually extremely important. You might have 20, 30 in there, depending on how complex the app is. What we're not doing is just choosing one and getting it wrong. And from the perspective of actually what I'm going to do for the rest of this, I retile these. That's one of the things I quite like doing. Just means we can see everything in one go. So if we go ahead and sort of push this through, what we can see is we can now start adding our buttons. Now, from my perspective, like I said earlier, what we can do is we can actually click around in here, no bother. And you'll notice the middle screen will sort of refresh and tell us, that's what we're currently looking at. But again, what we don't do is we can map on this middle window. And again, right clicking on here and choosing add to test case is we notice that the customer view work order is fully understood as the screen we're looking at. And then it's telling us this is our existing field, etc. So from our perspective, again, very smart. It understands the screen we're on, understands the button. But the other thing I quite like about this is Provar also, if we go back to this screen, when we come to actually execute that step, Provar expands the action button for us. So Provar in general reduces clicks all over the place when we test ServiceMax, because we don't really want to have dependencies on things that Provar should just understand. So if you notice there, with that click, it was a two-step process. Click on the sort of menu, click into the thing, and now we're into the right screen and happy days. So let's keep going through. I think what we can see is that we're now going to start, adding some of these fields. So we got the accept acknowledged by technician date and time. Again, if we wanted to sort of populate that, one thing to note is over here we have a variable. We know that's a variable because of the curly braces. So we can have a little play with that later. But again, just to sort of show you how we go about mapping this, is we go ahead and we can see, Provar understands it's the edit work order with WD screen. We know all the fields on here and all the custom fields, all coming from metadata. If we want to set this, you can see a hard-coded value, including a date timestamp, is pretty sort of difficult stuff. We do not want this to be backdated. What we choose is Control Spacebar. Now, our Control Spacebar, as we can see, is basically saying that we can go ahead and choose any of these things. And that tells us there's functions, but actually importantly in this case, we've got loads of variables down here because we actually read in some data from Excel. Again, I'll show you exactly how we do that later. But for now, you can see that I've got a variable here called acknowledge date, and you can immediately start parameterizing your test. You don't have to be doing some sort of record function and then afterwards slicing and dicing it however you want. So from our perspective, we're happy we got our data. If I now continue this test, then what we'll see is that that data will start getting added for us, and we move forward and we can see the billing types being added. The add travel button is now getting added as well. Again, what you see by design, a little bit of a lag for the sort of middle screen. That's because we're emulating what's going on in the real thing. So let's keep going through. Again, here, I think you get the idea, but I think just to sort of hammer it home, line type, right click, we now know we're on the sort of travel screen. We fully expect Provar to go, yep, you are on the travel screen, and this is the line type field. Away we go. So I'll sort of stop showing you that stuff now. But if we go through again, what we're using is variables to say the timestamp so that we don't end up with hard-coded ones. So this is now future dated by a day for start and 2 days by end. We've got all the formulas that will support that. And then what we're going to do is hit the update and keep on going. So hopefully you get the idea that, you know, what is traditionally extremely tricky to do mobile testing is that we're able to sort of set this stuff up very intuitively with regards to adding steps, running steps, and it's usually quite an arduous technical task to get anything like this. Now, one final thing I'll just quickly show you is asserting. So in the case of this account here, we're wanting to assert the data. So in our case, if we go ahead and choose read assert, so again, whenever we want to sort of do something like that, usually you can override something called the interaction type. We're saying in this case that, you know, you could maybe do lookups on that type of field, but in our case, we want to do read assert. If I choose read assert, you can pull out the value, check the value, and just notice that it's hard coded now. But again, if we want to start getting into variables, it's just Control Spacebar, and that will do the assert for us. So let's push this through, and then what we've got is our different test steps, and we're sort of complete on our test case because I've sort of clicked all the way through and we're happy. Now, what we can do at this point is just go and have a look at the report that's come out. This is something called Test Builder, and all the logging is in here, quite verbose logging. But if we wanted to get the information out, we can generate ourselves a PDF. And what we can see from that PDF is how long it took, all the different sort of steps here. Now, again, you've got an awful lot of API steps, which we're going to have a little bit of a deeper dive into a minute. But down the bottom here, we've got all our sort of evidencing around the UI test. You can have as many screenshots as you like. And in our case, we've just taken one that goes along with the UI assert for the account name and also the contact name. So we have that information stored down for longevity. If there, heaven forbid, something happened in production, you have your evidence from UAT that all look lovely at a point in time. So that's very much the sort of mobile flow with regards to authoring and looking through it. Let's just quickly sort of resume where we were in our deck to understand what we just saw. So we're seeing the FSA app executing and authoring, and that does support iOS and Android. We are using metadata to locate things, and on top of that, that whole calendar screen is something that's extremely bespoke to Provar, where we understand that screen. It's such an obvious starting point for the FSA tests. It's extremely important that that sort of with row or that table analysis of how to locate your exact word order is baked into Provar, and that's the case. And then really it's a case of all the different actions are supported, but importantly in a very dynamic way, intelligent way. In addition to that, it's a very similar authoring process that anyone who's a Provar user on the call would already be used to with regards to Test Builder helping us through it. And like I said, it does use our ServiceMax API. Now, the next test I'm going to go through now is actually the more traditional desktop testing. And we'll have a look at some interesting points as part of that. Now, the first thing we're going to see here is our test case. Is we're actually going to call a callable test. That's exactly what the mobile test did. So you've noticed here we got something called create and dispatch work order. Now, what was interesting is, of course, we might be doing mobile or we might be doing desktop. They both needed these steps. So what are these steps? It's actually an example of like a function. So if I double click it, what you'll see is this guy is doing all of these sort of individual steps at the lower level. None of it's in the mobile, none of it's in the browser. But what it does do is create data for me. So where does this come from, you ask? So first and foremost, what it's actually doing is running as a different user. So we have two users on this test. One's going to do the mobile login and the other one is doing the setup of data. One we've got here is we're creating variables. If you want to know where these APIs come from, it's always just drag and drop from here. And you can see we're doing a set values. So in the case of the account name, contact last name, it's good practice to set up new variables each time. Equally, when we get into, let's set ourselves a sort of new object here, we're actually creating the service order object. So again, if we're not needing to sort of set this up in the UI, let's do it the smartest and quickest way. So from our perspective, what you'll see down in the bottom right hand corner is something called the org browser. I can search for this particular object. I can go ahead and click into it and drag and drop it into my test. And again, you can see we've got the options to create, read, update, and delete on ServiceMax objects in Salesforce, and also SOQL queries. So we're actually using a SOQL query here. And with that SOQL query, what we're doing is we're pulling out the name field. And that is the work order number name that we use to search it in the mobile app. So from our perspective, doing everything nicely at the API level. Now, the only other thing that's going on in here is dispatch work order. So that's the thing that actually will do the equivalent of our dispatcher screen. And where you find them is here. So Provar doesn't support the big flash widget at the moment with regards to our test cases. It is only supporting sort of this approach to doing our dispatching, but we'll talk about that a little bit more in the roadmap. But with Provar doesn't support the flash component as it stands. But from perspective dispatch, if you want to use it, you drag it in from here. And also we've got this other one. Now what this other one is our syncing that we saw in mobile. So again, if we look at these tools for mobile, we've got the ability to sync metadata. We can put flight mode on. All that type of stuff is really important because if we do want to do offline testing, it is possible with Provar. So let's kick this test off. And then what we'll see again, we've got a few breakpoints in place and we'll start running through it. But the key thing it's going to begin with is exactly the same steps as we saw before with regards to setting up our work order and watching that go through. So this should be pretty quick. We sort of run through this stuff an awful lot quicker as it would be if you can imagine you were doing UI testing, but all these commands are going in, like I say, at an API level. So we'll watch this run through and you'll see as it ticks through, we've got our account, we've got our contact, we've got our case. Then we're pulling out our information using SOQL and we're dispatching the guy. Next, what we're going to do is this thing called import data for test. What that guy does in our test case is actually read from Excel, and that Excel sheet is then going to be used for the rest of our tests. What's happened there is we've actually swapped browsers. We've now gone in as a different user to continue this test case. So here we go, we're into our user, and what will happen is we're going to walk up to our order status pick list. Now, one thing you might have noticed is we've gone directly into our new record, and with that new record, we can continue our test case. So here we can see we can activate an inline edit. So when this next step's going to happen, when we do right click in exactly the same way as we would for the mobile, is we actually immediately know this is the work order view screen. We've got the order status field, and again, all of this metadata to find things. So we're not relying on unreliable ways of doing this. If we then keep on going, it puts it into our sort of inline edit mode. We set our status, we hit save, and now we're moving into sort of our ways of clicking into our ServiceMax screens. Now, from a technical standpoint, what these are basically a little frame that's happening, and it's a visual force page. So again, if we're mapping this for the first time, what you'll see is essentially Provar telling us the scaffolding of this page. It's saying this is a Salesforce layout. We know that it's the work order view screen, but the bit we're on now is an embedded page. It's a visual force page. And we're basically going to start clicking this guy, which is the create usage lines. Question here is that because it's a custom visual force page, Provar does need a locator. So it's not coming from metadata for this piece. So if we go and have a look at this, what we can see is if we were going to map it from scratch, Provar gives you options. We could go by label, we could go by XPath, we could go by CSS. The label is probably the way to go, looks completely clear. But if we did want to choose XPath, we can. What you're noticing on the left-hand side, though, is that all that highlighting is pretty much telling me this is not a very good XPath. But what's nice about Provar is it does give you all these attributes, and you can quite quickly amend that to add in this case, the @value attribute. The highlighting is telling us, yep, that's probably going to work quite nicely, and it's your choice. So for that type of locators, it really is up to the tester to choose what you think is the most reliable. But what we're now going to do is go through, we're going to select into that particular button, and then we'll go through and start to really start interesting in the ServiceMax screens themselves. So this point forward, we're then flipping back into the metadata view of the world, specifically the ServiceMax metadata, and you'll notice that we've got an awful lot of stuff going on the screen. And these screens are very familiar. They all look very similar, but they all might have different information. But again, if we start mapping this stuff, what I expect to see, as you can tell here, we're in the create usage lines estimate record type. We've got an add parts button. If we do the drop down, you'll notice all the other stuff is all here. None of this stuff needs to be sort of guessed at with regards to thorny locators. So it's very important because actually the definition of these type of buttons, this little plus button, they're all in here. They're all behind these different tabs. Extremely easy to click the wrong one, and then you wonder why is nothing happening. So that's the add parts thing. Again, we can click into that. We can walk through, and again, you can see we can always choose these little buttons to do next, next, next in the way we work. Or what we can go ahead and do is sort of choose, and you can see with Provar's got quite a lot of intelligent wait conditions that wait for certain things to happen, so that we don't start failing for silly reasons around sort of timing. Again, you might notice we just did all of those date time all in one go. So it's quite intelligent the way that it can sort of within a single step populate our date and all the different timestamps that go with it. And then what we'll do is go through and sort of carry on and start filling out our table at the bottom there. So again, we've now initiated the lookup part reference. All of this stuff in here, as you'd expect, is very mappable by Provar. And again, all of this thing is correctly mapping out of the box like a table. Now, the other thing to do if you are setting up these tests is to set this in this case would be a click, and you do need to hover before clicking. That's how this test is set up to make sure you're successful. And then we move forward and we can go ahead and sort of, again, you can notice that this value is coming from Excel here. So reading it directly from an Excel sheet, that means you can even loop through data. So if you wanted to use that in conjunction with a for each, you can have a lot of permutations in your ServiceMax test cases that just keep running similar tests, one definition, but each time with different data. And then finally, if we want to just, like I say, go through now and start to sort of do everything in one go, it really is just a case of sort of hitting the resume button if you want, or if you want in your demo, you can do this one at a time. One thing to bear in mind here, I heard a customer the other day say that they do all of their show and tells using Provar now, which I really liked. So that means it's in sprint definition of test cases can be achieved, and then you demo it to the business or you into the business side exactly what's happening. And I think that's quite a powerful thing because, again, it's quite Englishy the way we've described our tests. And in our case, what we've done is gone through a very simple flow here. But what I like about it is we started with zero data, Provar generated the whole thing in API steps, then moved over and carried on our tests from a UI standpoint. So that's really the desktop side of things. Let's go back quickly to the slides again, and we'll just sort of see what we've seen. Like I say, we're very much sort of expert in the navigation from the Salesforce space into the ServiceMax element where we can create all the objects we need. We're also, very much using callable tests as best practice so that we don't end up repeating test steps where we don't need to. That increases your velocity going forward. Data-driven testing, extremely important. I'll loop back in a minute and show you where the Excel piece gets defined. And then finally, like I say, Test Builder really is our sort of assistant here to help us show the best way of testing this stuff. Now, the next thing I wanted to briefly go into is remote execution. So I'm going to give you a glimpse of this now. Now, why this is important is what we've seen so far is FSA running local to me, my browser running local to me. More and more people are wanting to use cloud-based execution, and Provar supports that. So from our perspective, we're supporting Source Labs, whether that's desktop or mobile, Perfecto mobile, Browser Stack, which is more on the browser side, and then also you've got the more local approach to this, where you've got Appium Server if you're wanting to run on your actual devices hanging off your machines, or Selenium Grid where you would set this up, and bigger companies may have already have an investment in some of these pieces of hardware, and they can hang it off a grid that multiple people can all leverage and use within an organization. So it's not for Provar to tell you this is the way to do it. It's not for Provar to resell any of these bits of software, but it is for us to help you do this. And we have different customers that will have chosen whatever technology stack they like. So from our perspective, I'm just going to quickly show you how you'd set this up in Provar. So again, from our perspective, what you can see is down here, I mentioned earlier that we've got sort of two connections. So down here, we've got something called connections. In there, we've got admin and technician. So again, the technician's the guy we've been using for mobile testing, and admin's the one who's been creating our data. From the browser provider's perspective, this guy here is the desktop. That governs the things that we do when we drive the browser. But if we look at this, we've got an entry Perfecto. Now, if I wanted to start from scratch, you hit the green button, and you can see here we can set up Selenium Grid, Appium, Perfecto. You, of course, need to know your logins and all the different URLs for your own implementation here. But this is how you'd set up a new one. What I've got is an existing one for Perfecto here. So from our perspective, all we can see is essentially our logins to Perfecto. And then what I can see down here is I have a device. If I wanted to have a look at that particular device, what you can see is we've got iPad mini set up here. And we can call it what we like, but you'll notice that we can choose Apple for the iOS. We can choose whichever device we want. And what's really important here is Provar's implementation with Perfecto is we've just called Perfecto in order to find out what are the available models that we can use. The next thing it's doing is saying, well, of models, what's available? And actually, yes, there is one there. So with the description we've got, there's no guaranteed devices sitting there, but we know there should be one available to us now. And the last thing we'd need to do is say, well, okay, for the ServiceMax FSA, which is a mobile app tab here, which of these am I going to use? Because in our case, we've got the 353 FSA version, which is a re-signed version of that allows us to do our testing. That is sitting there ready to go. So I need to choose which one I want to use, and we've chosen that. So there's a two-step process to the setup. It's a case of setting up your Perfecto subscription, then telling the ServiceMax FSA mobile app which version I want to run. We've done all that. The last thing it would be from a setup perspective is to actually go in here and say, well, what do I want to run? And you'll see that I'm running a ServiceMax FSA from the application drop down. At that point, we can kick this off, but we do need to tell it, I want to run Perfecto. So again, I could be running this against my local iPad. I could be running it in different ways. I'm now telling it, I want to run it with Perfecto by doing this. If we kick this off, we do share these devices, so I'm not going to guarantee the execution of this because it might not actually select it. But what I'm going to do is show you Perfecto now. So this is my login to Perfecto, which is essentially the browser login into that application. Just notice what's just come online is my running test. Great. That does take, as you can see, a few minutes. The reason why it takes quite a long time on Perfecto is because actually part of its execution is we install the app from scratch, which is pretty cool. I mean, that's sort of very pure. There's no sort of, oh my God, I installed it and then tweaked it and then everything passed. And then in production, everything goes horrible. This is going from absolutely the sort of beginning point. So from our perspective, that's now running and that will continue running. Let me show you for now, though, exactly what's going on in a previous run. So if I double click this, what you'll get is this view of the world. So in this view of the world, we're able to see a whole video of this execution. So from my perspective, I can say a lot of this at the beginning is setup, setup, setup. If we get into the later stages, what we should see when we hit the sort of play button is what's exactly going on our mobile device. If we sort of skimmy forward, what we can see is now Provar driving these screens, and we're able to sort of get through it. Again, if you click over here, there's an awful lot of sort of logging information going on. But again, I think this is all good stuff. You can export all these videos, you can have it down. But the reason why you'd want to do this, just to remind you the business case here, is if you wanted to genuinely run across a number of operating systems, a number of devices, this avoids you having to go out and purchase them. If you know you're a particular iOS of an iPad, that's all you need, then the other alternative might be just invest in your hardware so you can do your mobile testing. But where people don't want to do that, they typically go down this road. Perfecto is one of the solutions, and we've been working hard on making that quite slip. But you can see we do also have some of the other sort of providers included as well. So that is sort of the points, and you can see my test is just continue to run there as it runs through. So good. That is the last demo I was going to show you. let me just recap on that. So what we can see is, what we just saw is really how do we set up remote execution, two-step process, and then what you do need to do is when you're setting up, configuring your mobile connection, in particular for Perfecto, you do need to choose, is there available a device? What is that particular device type you're choosing, and what's the instance? When you run it, you do have to choose the drop-down in the list to make sure you've got the right sort of execution chosen. And if you choose desktop, then of course it's not going to call Perfecto at all. And the way you would get your results back is, like I say, jump onto the Perfecto website and have a look through that. I've got a couple more slides left to go, and really this slide's just talking about that. Okay, great, Geraint, we've set up how we want to do our tests on the desktop. We've set up for the mobile. That's fantastic. But on top of that, once we've got our test cases and we're happy with them, more times than not now, for being efficient and to make it easier for the ServiceMax upgrades, you're going to really want to run this all the time. You shouldn't be this, I'm just going to run because I've got an upgrade. You want to be able to run nightly, and a lot more times than that. Frequently, you could run intraday as well. And so realistically, test is just one part of that. So from my perspective, Provar itself would actually back up its test in a version control system. So I would say that more and more here, the version control system is your point of truth. And then as the cycle goes around, what we're saying is you will make your changes in the build phase. You will be releasing potentially quite frequently. You want good reporting. So Provar itself will contribute to that reporting. We can basically have dashboards in the likes of Jenkins, inside Salesforce itself with different dashboards there. We can integrate with the likes of the Jira and Jira plugins like Zephyr, etc. If we want to write back all this sort of interesting execution information, then of course, as the cycle goes through, we're replaying our next releases, developing, and then we're back into test. So this cycle is very important, and it's a journey. And not, I don't know that many companies that have fully nailed this whole thing automatically, but we do want to move towards that model. The final points for me really are around roadmap. So what I've shown you today on the desktop side was Classic, and I think there's probably a number of you using Classic, but we ain't going to be on Classic forever. So from Provar's perspective, of course, that is part of our roadmap to move our ServiceMax testing onto Lightning as well. The other part of what we do is to really keep you abreast with the different versions, because of course, everything's moving forward. So from the perspective of the version we were testing today, I think it was 18.2, 19.1 is available now, and I also know 20 is on the horizon. Provar will be sort of testing those things. I also sort of alluded before about Dispatcher, which is the sort of Flash component, which is quite hard to test. And for that reason, Provar has an API to achieve that. That API will continue to be maintained, but also we do know that Service Board is coming as well with regards to its new implementation that will supersede the Dispatcher for many customers, and that's again something we'll be paying attention to. And also ServiceMax Go from again another sort of the future, I think, of the mobile piece, and so we'll be sort of paying attention to that. So just be aware, these are things we're thinking about for our roadmap, but obviously from my perspective, that's not only limited to those things, and the product itself, of course, has a very healthy roadmap as well. So if you're interested in learning more, what I would suggest that we do book a discovery meeting where we can sort of do a deeper dive and really understand your own requirements. You're going to have different tooling internally. You're going to have different challenges that you've come across, and we can discuss them in depth. So in part of that, we can also, discuss your requirements, review exactly how we can achieve that. So by all means, you can fill out the post-webinar survey or email us as well, or email myself. What I will say is, if you're interested, we do a proof of concept, which is free of charge. So if you are able to share access to your org with us after NDAs, we will develop this test scenario and we'll happily show you that working. So I think from my perspective, that's what I was hoping to cover today. So I guess hand it back to you, Hetty.
Fantastic, thanks Geraint. And so finally, it just leaves me to say thank you again to our presenters today, Chuck and Geraint, and thank you to all of you for attending. Bye for now.